This Day in Sports History. Welcome to another edition of This Day in Sports History, a member of the Sports History Network. You can find more info and more podcasts at sportshistorynetwork.com. And one of the podcasts that you'll find there is Sports Forgotten Heroes. Host Warren Rogan released a new episode this week discussing the first African-American coach in professional football. And if you're like me and thought that was Art Shell, you will be surprised to learn that's not the case. So check out the latest edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes wherever you get your podcasts. It's September 11th, and on this day in 1985, Pete Rose became the all-time hits king in Major League Baseball. Or did it actually happen earlier? Pete Rose picked up his first hit in the major leagues on April 13, 1963. His 4,000th hit came exactly 21 years later. Between that time, a little closer to 1 than 4,000, Rose figured that he could be the Babe Ruth of singles. Rose was not a mad scientist or an evil genius working on how to get more hits in some baseball version of a beaker-filled dungeon. Sure, he studied pitchers and their tendencies, but he had a feel for the game and an anticipation of what was going to happen before it happened. Well, at this point in 1985, Rose was 44 years old, and he was the player-manager of the Cincinnati Reds, his hometown club, the team he'd broken into the majors with 23 seasons earlier. He'd been around the league a little bit. He spent some time in Philadelphia and Montreal before coming back home to spend the final years of his playing career chasing the record that he'd set his sights on back in 1963. Ty Cobb's seemingly unattainable record of 4,191 hits. Well, that's at least what everybody said. 4,191, it's impossible. Getting to 4,000, that's nearly impossible. But he had been consistent over his time in the majors. Good for about 200 hits a season, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little bit more. Rose picked up 2 hits and tied Cobb's mark of 4,191 on September 8th when the Reds were in Chicago, in a game that he really was not even supposed to be playing in. Now, as a player-manager, he could put himself in the lineup or not. Well, at this point, Rose was only hitting against right-handed pitchers. Left-hander Steve Trout was the scheduled starter for the Cubs on the 8th, and so Rose wasn't going to play. But Trout had a bicycling accident the night before, and he cut his pitching hand up enough that he couldn't grip the ball well. And so instead of the left-hander Trout, Cubs manager Jim Fry inserted right-hander Reggie Patterson. So Rose inserted himself into the lineup. He tied the record in the 8th inning, and then the rain came. Now, if there hadn't been a 2-hour rain delay, or if Wrigley Field had lights at that point, he may have broken the record of 4,191 on this night. But the rain did come, and the Cubs were still a few years from adding lights. When the game resumed as darkness began to fall, Rose came to the plate in a 5-5 game, but he grounded out the third, and the game was stopped due to darkness soon after, ending in a 5-5 tie. And so, to this day now, the 11th of September, 1985. The Reds were back home against the San Diego Padres, facing right-hander Eric Schau. Here's the call from Marty Brenneman and Joe Nuxall from that day.
He levels the bat a couple of times. Schau kicks and he fires. Rose swings. There it is! There it is! Get out! Get out! All right! Hit number 4192. A line drive single into left center field. A clean base hit. And it is pandemonium here at Riverfront Stadium. The fireworks exploding overhead. The Cincinnati dugout has emptied. The applause continues unabated. Rose completely encircled comes out to give Pete a great big hug and a kiss. Joe, quite an emotional scene here at the ballpark. This outpouring of affection from this standing room only crowd as he turns a complete circle, waving and doffing his batting helmet to the crowd. And the folks on this date, September the 11th, certainly have not been disappointed one iota.
In true Charlie Hustle fashion, he'd pick up 41-93 later in the game when he tripled and he drove in 2 runs and a 2-0 win for the Reds. Rose would play another season and add another 62 hits to finish his 24-year career with 4,256 hits. Now, I said he sort of broke the record on this night, and let me explain what I mean by that. Rose actually broke Cobb's record in Chicago on the 8th. What, you say? All right, hang with me here for a second. In 1981, there was a statistical guy who went through all of Ty Cobb's games, and he found that there were 2 hits that he had been credited with that he actually didn't get. He informed Major League Baseball of this 4 years earlier, back in 1981, but the word had not yet drifted out to all the people who make the record books, and so here in 85, Ty Cobb was still listed with 4,191 hits. The record books have been updated now, so if you look at any record book, you will see Cobb with 4,189. So technically, he actually bested Cobb on September 8th in Chicago. But everybody celebrated on this day in 85, so it's the official day of Pete Rose passing Ty Cobb. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge what happened on this day in 2001, that fateful Tuesday when terrorist attacks were carried out in New York, D.C., and United Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers thwarted a 4th strike. Everything came to a screeching halt as attention was turned to what happened that day. Baseball games were canceled for 10 days. College football and the NFL games were postponed the following weekend. The Ryder Cup, scheduled to be held in England in late September, was canceled. There was obvious uncertainty about being in a stadium with 50 or 60,000 people. There was also the idea of what was an appropriate amount of time to mourn the dead, remember the sacrifices. But athletics, sports, teams, events helped us heal. It wasn't the only thing, but it was important. And it let us think about and focus on something other than the horror that thousands of people faced on this day. And I'll talk about a few of those events in the coming weeks that actually helped us heal just a little bit each time we watched a game. On this day in 1991, it was a no-hitter in Atlanta, but this was no ordinary no-hitter. Typically, a no-hitter is one guy pitching a solid 9 innings, walking a few, maybe a guy makes an error somewhere along the way, but he doesn't give up a hit. There's been the occasional 2-player combined no-hitter like the famous Babe Ruth Ernie Shore no-hitter, which was really a perfect game by Shore, but we've already talked about that one on the podcast, so I'll leave that one alone. In fact, at this point in baseball history, there had just been 6 previous combined no-hitters, and interestingly enough, one of those 6 had been pitched just 2 months before. But what made this one unique is that it had never happened in the National League before. Well, on this night, Kent Merker got the start. He went 6 complete innings, he threw 82 pitches, he walked 2, and he struck out 6. Then Mark Wohlers came out of the pen in the 7th, and he threw 2 complete innings, and then Alejandro Pena came on to close things out in the 9th in a 1-0 win over the Padres. Of course, San Diego had 0 hits on the night. And on this day in 2010, it was a college football shocker that sent rumbles through Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. 3 years and 10 days after Appalachian State had beaten Michigan, the Dukes of James Madison became the second FCS team to beat a ranked FBS opponent. Virginia Tech had been preseason number 10 before losing by a field goal in Week 1 to number 3 Boise State. This was supposed to be a bounce-back week for the Hokies, a chance to refocus. They certainly were not feeling overconfident. JMU had moved up to number 12 in the FCS Top 25 after an opening week trucking of Morehead State. Now, if you need a refresher on the differences between FBS and FCS, you can go back and re-listen to the September 1st edition of this dish. The Hokies put points on the board first, taking a 10-zip lead after a field goal in the second quarter. The Dukes quieted the Lane Stadium crowd with a screen pass that turned into a 78-yard touchdown reception with 4:53 to play in the half. Tech answered with another field goal, and it was a shaky 6-point Virginia Tech lead at the break. It seemed like the Hokies were taking control in the third quarter, though. They started the quarter with a solid drive, but that stalled out. They settled for another field goal. Everybody wearing maroon and burnt orange that day figured more points were on the way. Little did they know at that point, that was it. The Dukes did a good job on several counts. One, they shortened the game by running the football a lot. Quarterback Jeff Dudzik only threw 8 passes that day. He didn't throw enough to even get a QB rating that game. But if you're going to run the ball almost exclusively, then you better take care of it and not waste your opportunities. And they did that too. When Dudzik ran into the end zone from 7 yards out, it was 16-14 Hokies. Things in Blacksburg started to get all puckery. Hokie quarterback Tyrod Taylor picked a bad day to have a bad day. And speaking of picks, he threw one late in the third quarter to squelch a drive and give the Dukes offense the ball back. After an 8-play, 62-yard drive, JMU punched it in again, and once again, it was Dudzik calling his own number. But still, the Dukes only led 21-16. There was a lot of time left on the clock, nearly the entire fourth quarter. But the Hokies could not do anything with the football, mostly because they coughed it up again. With 5.5 minutes to play and the Hokies at the Dukes' 11-yard line, the JMU defense came up with another turnover, this time a fumble recovery. And from that point, the Dukes ate the clock, running it down to 13 seconds to play before they were forced to punt. A roughing the punter call gave the ball back to James Madison, and from there, they took a knee to record the upset. After the loss, Virginia Tech's season got better. They went on an 11-game winning streak and earned a berth to the Orange Bowl at the end of the year. The Dukes, however, suffered a bunch of injuries in the following weeks, and they struggled through a 5-game stretch of losses against ranked FCS opponents. But the one thing that nobody can take away from JMU is what they did to Virginia Tech on this day. Time now for today's Ain't Got Nothing to Do with Sports fun fact. Dolphins give each other names with unique whistles, which makes me wonder if there is a dolphin equivalent to "You talking to me?" That's all I've got for you today. This and every episode of This Day in Sports History is researched, written, voiced, and produced by me, Steve White. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll be back tomorrow with another edition of This Day in Sports History. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.